The night the twins were born, the Black River went still. Wind dropped, the sawmill belts hung loose, and the whole town stood as if a hand pressed down on its crown. People would later call it the paused night, but in the moment it felt like a warning no one could read. In the small Benson house near the waterline, Martha labored while Samuel moved between kettle, lamp, and door, counting without speaking. He had always counted when afraid, and tonight his lips moved like a metronome made of skin. He counted the breath between thunder and the breath after it, even when there was no thunder at all. The midwife kept her head low and her tools clean, and the room smelled of soap, hot iron, and old pine. 2 cries rose, thin as wire, then softened at once as if the house itself swallowed sound. Samuel stared at the wet crowns and said thanks that did not reach his mouth. Martha looked at the faces and felt a pull in her chest that scared her more than the pain. She feared a world that loved noise and called it life. Her mother had taught her to keep a house where cups did not clink and doors did not complain. She had learned to step on the sides of the stairs where the boards stayed shy. She thought quiet was not only peace but proof that a family knew how to live. Now she pressed warm cloth to the tiny backs and said in her mind that loud breath is wasteful breath. Through the window the river held its black plate, unmoved by wind or moon, as if the water were listening too. A barn owl did not call. Even the mice under the floor made small plans and waited. The midwife nodded and said the babies were well-shaped and well-timed, and that luck liked a clean room. Her hands were pale from scrubbing, and the skin at her knuckles was dry and cracked in tidy lines. She lifted each child and held them close to her ear, not for a kiss, but for a measure. She asked if there was a quiet place to rest the little ones while she boiled the cloths again. Samuel led her to the front room where the light fell on a cradle he had built in a rush that week. He had shaved the rockers smooth and glued a thin strip of felt below them so wood would not tap wood. He had tied a cord from cradle to bedpost so a small pull could rock the basket in an even stroke. He told himself that steadiness was love. He told himself that any startle at night could shake a child out of the world. When the twins settled, he stood with his hand on the cord and imagined how many pulls would bring morning. Martha watched that hand and felt something settle in her mind like a lid on a jar. She wanted the world to hold still long enough for the girls to learn what stillness meant. Outside, neighbors waited on the road, each one certain they ought to be kind by staying away. They left bread by the gate and broth on the step and spoke the news along the line of houses. The millmen stood near the dead wheel and said the river would turn again when it was ready. They called this a blessing with a strange face. Inside, the lamp flame leaned but did not flicker, and the walls took every sound and kept it. The house had always asked for obedience, but tonight it asked in a voice that was easy to agree with. Samuel went from hinge to hinge and rubbed a bit of tallow where the metal wanted to talk. Soon, clean hands would return to teach good breath. Verity Hale came back 3 days later, the same way she always did, without notice, without sound, as though the road itself carried her into a doorway when she was wanted. She had no family in the town, no place that was hers. Yet every birth in 2 counties carried her fingerprints, and no one dared question why she stayed so clean in a place where dirt clung to everyone. Her hands were pale as milk and scrubbed raw, the nails short and rimmed with cracks that looked painful, but never bled. When she lifted them, people felt safer, as if disease and danger could not pass into a room she entered. She asked nothing of payment beyond broth or a candle, and so her presence was treated as blessing. That night, when she leaned over the cradle to study Rose and Lila, the house itself seemed to settle its bones in silence. She touched their chests with the back of her knuckle, then pressed her ear to each tiny mouth, listening longer than any mother expected. Martha shifted on the bed, uneasy but grateful, for the babies lay so still under her watch. Verity murmured about calm lungs, about how the world forgets that breath can betray a child. She spoke of second birth, not as something mystical, but as an order of care. The body must be taught a quieter rhythm once it has survived its first cry. She said a child who learns to master silence can escape illness, madness, even grief. Her words slid into the air like warm oil, smooth and convincing, and Samuel nodded, though he did not know what he agreed to. Verity smiled when he did, for she believed agreement was the first discipline. The cradle rocked with its muted tick, and she praised its design, her pale hand trailing along the felted runners. She said it was good that the house had already chosen its path, good that it had no echo in its corners. She asked if the windows opened onto the river, and when Samuel showed her, she leaned close and whispered that the water was black enough to hide a scream. Then she turned back as if she had spoken nothing at all. She lifted Rose, then Lila, and pressed their faces together cheek to cheek, saying that twins were mirrors and mirrors must not be allowed to speak out of turn. Her clean hands held them as though she weighed them against some unseen measure. When Martha asked if the girls were healthy, Verity only replied that they were calm. And calmness was better than health. She returned them to the cradle and tied a thin ribbon around each wrist, not tight, just present. She called these markers, saying they would help the parents know which twin slept deeper, which one needed more lessons. She smiled again, soft and simple, and the gesture looked like care. But beneath her words lay something that did not invite argument. She told Martha she must not wake the girls to feed them if they were resting in rhythm, for hunger would pass, but a broken pattern would last a lifetime. She reminded Samuel to keep the ledger she had left on the table, thin book, pale pages, a place for marks beside dates. "Good breath leaves proof," she whispered, as if it were a blessing. When she left, the air smelled of soap and something sharp, something that clung to skin. Samuel closed the door behind her and felt relief, yet also a strange pride, as though his family had been chosen for a test. Martha pressed her lips against the twins' damp hair and tried to hear their heartbeats. They pulsed slow, steady, like a clock that kept its secrets well. Outside, the river began to move again, but only faintly, as if listening before it spoke. The town would not see what rules had been planted that night. They would only smile at the Benson twins, never knowing that kindness had already become a quiet form of control. The cradle stood at the center of the room like a piece of furniture that was more rule than wood. Samuel had shaped it with his own hands, carving the rockers in long, even strokes until they moved without sound. Beneath them he had fixed a narrow strip of felt, so no scrape or groan would ever betray the rhythm. Inside, the base was fitted with a small pendulum hidden under the bedding, a weight that made the cradle tick when it rocked. Each motion marked time, a quiet measure that slipped into the ears of the newborns and pressed itself against their shallow chests. At first, it seemed harmless, even comforting, like the hum of a mother's song. But there was no song in that house, and the ticking became its own lullaby, stern and precise. If the babies stirred or whimpered, the weight hesitated, the cradle slowed, and the sound stopped altogether. The silence it left behind was heavy, a silence that expected obedience. Martha tried not to question it. She had been raised to see order as love, and Samuel swore the cradle would teach discipline before the world had a chance to spoil the children. Aunt Dinah arrived from the coast and praised the invention with wide eyes, calling it a gift from God that measured rhythm into flesh. She said infants needed patterns, that lungs grew strong when they learned to move with the pulse of wood and weight. She laughed when the cradle stilled at the sound of a wail, saying it was proof the girls would not waste breath. To her, it was no different from setting a clock on the mantel and trusting it to hold the day together. Yet she never sat close enough to hear how the twins began to breathe in short, sharp measures, as if their tiny ribs had already surrendered to the ticking law. The cradle soon dictated the house. Meals were timed by its beat, lamps trimmed when it slowed, and prayers whispered in its pauses. Samuel sat beside it at night with his hand on the cord, counting the pulls as if each one added a number to his own life. Martha felt uneasy watching the babies lie so still, their lips parted but soundless, their eyes half-lidded even when awake. She told herself this was peace, that peace was safer than noise, and that children born on a paused night must carry stillness in their bones. She kept the ledger Verity had left and wrote marks for each sleep that passed without interruption, each breath that did not rise into a cry. The pages filled quickly, thin black lines like stitches on pale cloth, and she began to believe the book more than her own ears. Neighbors who visited left the house whispering, unsettled without knowing why. They said the twins were perfect, too perfect, and that their silence made the air feel wrong. Clara Dunn remarked that she had never heard them scream, not once since their birth, and that no child could grow without raising a voice. But Aunt Dinah silenced her with a firm smile, saying rhythm was stronger than instinct and that this family had been chosen to prove it. The neighbors left bread and broth at the door, eager to be kind, unwilling to see more. Inside, the cradle rocked on its measured line, the tick filling the walls, the twins learning that even their own lungs had rules. The house listened, and the river outside moved slower with each passing night, as if it too had begun to keep the rhythm. Dr. Lionel Pike arrived in the second month, tall and neat in a gray coat that seemed too fine for a lumber town. He was a physician by trade, though no one could name the last time he had treated an open wound. His work, as he explained to Samuel and Martha, was in the unseen matters of air and rhythm, the science of lungs that did not waste their strength. He praised the cradle at once, running his gloved hand along its edge as though it were an instrument. He bent over the twins and watched how their tiny chests rose and fell, slow and even, no louder than the brush of a hand across cloth. He said this was discipline, rare and remarkable, the mark of children who had been given a second birth into order. His voice never lifted, his smile never broke, but there was weight in every word that made Martha's heart pull between pride and dread. He brought with him a thin book, bound in calfskin and marked only with 2 words on the front, "Good breath." He opened it on the table and explained that families of promise kept such ledgers, records that outlived memories, proof that order had been learned. He wrote the twins' names across the first page, then beneath them the date, and beside the date a small symbol, a circle with a line through its middle. He said it marked a lesson completed. Samuel asked what lesson had been given, and Dr. Pike replied that the stillness of their sleep was itself instruction, that every night without a cry was a page written in silence. He instructed Martha to add her own marks daily, each one tied to the cradle's rhythm, so that in years to come there would be no dispute that Rose and Lila had been taught properly. The doctor stayed longer than expected, moving from room to room as if testing the walls for sound. He stood in the doorway of the small chamber lined with cloth and nodded, saying it was wise to give noise no place to rest. He traced a finger along the ledger's spine and remarked that breath was the body's most wasteful habit, and that wasteful habits needed correction before they hardened into life. Martha watched his clean, careful hand move across the page and felt as though her daughters were already becoming smaller under the weight of the book. Still, she followed his instructions, dipping ink each evening, drawing lines and circles, telling herself it was proof of care. By the time he left, the ledger lay open on the table like scripture, its pale pages waiting to be filled. The neighbors who stopped by to deliver bread saw only a family under the guidance of a learned man, a household praised for discipline. None of them read the marks for what they were. To an outsider, the book looked like love, like attention given with precision. But to the twins, who breathed in measured silence beneath their ribbons, it read like training. An unseen hand tightening around their lungs, one mark at a time. At the far end of the Benson house, past the narrow hallway that smelled of soap and lamp oil, a small door was kept closed with a simple wooden latch. Samuel told neighbors it was for storage, a place where Martha kept cloth or jars. But the truth lay in what the walls had been made to swallow. Behind that door was a chamber no larger than a pantry, its boards wrapped in layers of fabric nailed flat and padded with wool. Every seam had been tucked tight, every corner pressed smooth until not even a whisper could find a place to echo. Inside that space, words did not travel, cries did not return. When the twins were set upon the floor and their mouths opened in wail, the sound thinned and fell against the fabric as if dropped into snow. The air felt thick and heavy, as though even breath had to push harder to exist. To Martha and Samuel, this was safety. To the girls, it was the first lesson in silence that could not be undone. Martha carried the ledger into the room and made her marks while Rose and Lila sobbed without answer. She told herself she was teaching them that noise was waste, that lungs could be trained to rest instead of strain. Samuel stood at the doorway, hand on the latch, his eyes wet but steady, convinced that obedience was mercy, and mercy was proof of love. Aunt Dinah praised the chamber, calling it genius, a room that knew how to hush. She said it would shape the girls into women who could survive anything because nothing would ever rattle their rhythm. The cradle was a tool, but the room was law. Schoolteacher Pearl Witt discovered the chamber by accident. She had come with a basket of bread and stepped too far down the hallway when Martha went to fetch a cloth. The small door was ajar, and from it came no sound at all, though she could see the twins inside, mouths wide, faces red, tiny fists striking the padded walls. Pearl froze, the sight burning her throat. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt stolen in that heavy air. When Martha returned and saw her standing there, she only closed the door and asked Pearl if she had brought butter. Pearl lowered her gaze, her hands trembling around the basket, and she said nothing. She would say nothing for the rest of her life, not because she agreed, but because the silence of that room had already shown her what happened to voices that tried to rise. The room became part of daily life in the Benson house. Each cry swallowed, each wail erased, each lesson recorded in neat ink strokes in the good breath ledger. To an outsider, the home looked calm, even blessed with its quiet twins and tidy mother. But in truth, the house itself had become an accomplice, its walls stitched to enforce rules no one dared name. And still the river outside flowed slow and black, as if it too listened and remembered the sound that had been buried alive within those cloth-wrapped walls. The winter that followed pressed itself over the town like a lid, the river rimmed with ice, the mill wheels frozen in their troughs. In the Benson house, Samuel nailed canvas around the edges of a narrow porch, leaving just enough space for 2 cradles side by side. He said children needed to harden, that lungs grew stronger when tested by cold. Martha tucked the twins beneath thin quilts, their bodies so small the cloth barely rose. The air outside cut like glass, yet the house itself stayed warm, lamps burning steady, the hearth stacked with logs. Still, the girls were carried out each afternoon and laid where the breath stung sharpest. Neighbors passing by saw only a family devoted to health, to discipline. They did not see the way each nap was written later in the ledger, marked as a lesson completed, another step in the march of silent obedience. The porch became ritual. Each day, Samuel wound the cradle cords and let the twins rock in rhythm while frost gathered on the canvas seams. The ticking weight inside the wood slowed in the cold, its pauses growing longer as though measuring how still the children could remain. Their lashes caught frost, and their lips parted in small clouds that vanished too quickly. Martha would peek through the glass of the kitchen window, her hands clutching the sill, telling herself that suffering now meant survival later. She remembered Verity Hale's words, that second birth required calm lungs, and she tried to believe that what looked like cruelty was in fact a cure. Clara Dunn, the neighbor, came one evening with a pot of broth, her breath rising in plumes as she stepped onto the frozen porch. She stopped short when she saw the twins under their quilts, tiny faces pale against the wool, lashes iced as if kissed by winter itself. She reached to touch Rose's cheek and felt the skin cool, too cool for a child so young. Her stomach turned, but Martha appeared in the doorway with a smile too calm for the scene. She said the cold built strength, that it taught the body to find warmth from within. Clara wanted to argue, but her voice faltered under the weight of the silence that clung to the house. She left the broth, nodded, and walked away, telling herself she had no right to question what a mother chose. The winter stretched on and the lessons multiplied. Nights of frostbite kisses, naps broken only when the cradle tick stilled and Samuel came to reset it. The ledger filled with more circles and lines, each mark a testament to the endurance of two bodies not yet old enough to walk. To others, the porch looked like care, a kind of rustic cure against sickness. But in truth, it was a test, each breath stolen by the cold, each beat of the cradle demanding silence. The twins learned to lie still, to breathe shallow, to wait for warmth that did not come. And in that long season, the house grew quieter still, as though the walls themselves had decided that only silence deserved to live. In spring, when the thaw came and the river began to move again, the lessons did not soften. They only changed rooms. Samuel cleared a corner of the barn, laying down planks scrubbed clean and setting a stool where he could sit with the ledger open across his knees. It was here that Rose and Lila were brought each morning, placed before their father in the cold smell of hay and damp wood. Their arms and legs were bound with thin splints, strips of pine rubbed with salt until the fibers stiffened like iron. These were tied against their small limbs, holding them into lines that Samuel said were proper angles, proof that the body could be shaped by will if caught young enough. The girls winced but did not cry. The room with no echo had already taught them that sound was wasted breath. Martha stood in the doorway and watched, her face pale and her hands folded, convincing herself that discipline was love and that love demanded cost. When the splints were secured, Samuel placed long paper tubes in their mouths, telling them to blow soft counts through the hollow until he raised his hand. Rose's breaths came thin, steady, as though she had learned the trick of obedience. Lila's came in short bursts, trembling at the edge of panic until Samuel pressed her lips tighter to the rim and whispered that rhythm was survival. Each count was written in the ledger, small marks, circles, and dashes, symbols that looked harmless to anyone else but read like a language of control. When the lesson ended, Martha carried out a single pail of milk, ladled into cups so narrow that only sips could pass. Each girl was allowed a measure once the breath exercises were finished, as if nourishment were not a right but a reward. The one witness to this ritual beyond the family was Caleb Rowe, a thin farmhand taken on that season to help with haying. Samuel trusted him to keep the timer, a brass watch with a cracked face, instructing him to note every interval when the girl's breathing faltered. Caleb's hands shook as he clicked the stem, his eyes darting between the ledger and the children's stiff bodies. He had grown up among rough work and hard winters, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this calm, deliberate cruelty dressed in the clothes of care. He swallowed hard when Samuel praised the twins for their stillness, when Martha dabbed their foreheads with cloth and called it devotion. Caleb felt his stomach twist, but he said nothing, for to speak against it would mean turning on the very family that gave him shelter. Day after day, the lessons stretched, milk and salt and straight lines repeated until the twins no longer resisted. Their limbs grew thinner, their faces calm, their lungs trained into patterns too rigid for play. Caleb kept the watch and bit his lip, unable to look directly at their eyes, which seemed older than their years. The ledger thickened with marks, every page another record of obedience disguised as growth. Outside, the barn looked like any other, a place of labor and life. But within its walls, Rose and Lila were being written into shapes no child should wear, their silence carved deeper, their breaths measured like coin. The house had birthed the rules, but the barn had become their crucible, and Caleb, though sick with dread, was forced to keep the clock that told the girls when they had suffered enough to be fed. The cellar had always been damp, its stones slick with a film that never dried even in summer. But Samuel cleared a space there as if preparing for a service. He swept the floor until dust rose like smoke, then set a wide tin basin on a low wooden stand. When Pastor Ephraim Ward arrived, he did not ask why he was summoned. He moved with the solemn care of a man who believed holiness belonged anywhere it was asked, even in the dark underbelly of a house. He placed his hand over the basin, his other clutching a small book bound in leather, and murmured words that seemed less like prayer than instruction. He spoke of cleansing and second chances, of children made pure not once but twice, and his voice carried the calm weight of ritual. The twins stood barefoot on the stone, their small shoulders wrapped in thin linen, eyes wide as if they knew instinctively that something permanent was being sealed. Pastor Ward dipped his fingers in water Martha had carried down in a pitcher, clean from the well, and let it fall into the tin basin. He smiled at Rose, then at Lila, the expression kind but unsettling in its certainty, as though he were looking not at children but at vessels to be filled. He called the water renewal a gift that would train the body as much as the soul, and he blessed the basin with words that no one else could quite hear. Samuel nodded with each phrase, his face stern with pride, while Martha stood stiffly in the corner clutching the ledger as if it were scripture. The pastor pressed his palm against the surface of the water, then drew a circle with his wet finger across the rim of the basin, leaving a streak that glistened in the lantern light. He said the water would hold memory now, that each lesson practiced before it would bind deeper, written into the very breath of the twins. The cellar smelled of damp cloth and rust, the air colder than the rooms above, yet no one shivered. When Pastor Ward lifted his hand and pressed a drop of water to each child's forehead, they flinched but made no sound. He told them silence was the holiest response. That obedience made them closer to the divine. He reminded Samuel and Martha that children raised in rhythm carried no corruption, that their lungs would not betray them, that their discipline would mark the family for generations. Caleb Rose, sent to fetch more wood, stood in the stairwell and watched, his face pale. He had seen animals baptized before slaughter in the same way, touched by water, calmed by blessing. He bit his tongue and turned away before anyone saw his fear. When the pastor finished, he closed the book and pressed both hands together in satisfaction. He looked once more at the basin, smiled at the twins with their damp foreheads, and said the house had been chosen. Then he climbed the stairs and left, his boots striking hollow on the boards until the front door closed. The cellar remained darker than before, the water still and cold in the basin as if waiting for another touch. To Martha it felt holy, a shield against the world. To Caleb it felt like a mark that could never be washed away. Above, the house sat quiet, its walls tight with silence, but underneath the basin gleamed faintly in the lantern light, a vessel of renewal that made the Benson home feel blessed. It also made it feel unbearably cold. Nora Bell had walked into many houses in her years as a county nurse, places where sickness clung to corners and poverty pressed its smell into every board. But nothing prepared her for the Benson cellar. She had come on a quiet tip, a folded note left at her station that said only, "See the cupboard by the basin." She entered politely, Martha leading her down the stairs with a calm smile. Samuel close behind, his hand resting on the rail as if guiding her pace. The cellar was colder than the spring air outside, the tin basin still in its place, water dull and stagnant. What caught her eye first was not the basin but the cupboard beside it, tall and narrow, its doors bound by a loop of twine. Martha undid the knot without hesitation, as if eager to show what lay within. Inside were rows of glass jars, each one sealed, each one holding a square of white cotton pressed flat against the glass as though captured in time. The sight was not grotesque in the usual way. There was no blood, no decay, but it unsettled Nora more than any wound she had tended. Each jar bore a date written in careful ink, some with a small mark beside it, a circle or a line, symbols that matched the ledger she had glimpsed upstairs. She lifted one jar from the shelf and held it to the lantern. The cotton looked ordinary, but pressed into its weave were faint ridges, the impression of wrinkles that seemed too purposeful to be chance. Martha said gently that these were voice records, saved pieces of the children's cries captured before they could vanish into nothing. Nora asked how, her voice trembling, and Verity Hale, who had appeared quietly at the nurse's side, answered that cloth held memory when used at the right moment. She explained with pride that each square had been pressed to a child's mouth at the height of a cry, then smoothed and sealed so that no sound was wasted. Nora's throat closed as she realized the implication. These were not keepsakes. They were trophies of silence, proof that even a child's wail could be disciplined into obedience. Verity called them evidence of progress, saying each jar marked a step toward calm lungs, that the twins would thank their parents for such careful record. She smiled with her clean hands folded, her tone calm. But to Nora it was the calmness of something that had no doubt it was right. The nurse's hands shook as she replaced the jar, her fingertips clinking against the glass, the sound sharp in the still cellar. She wanted to leave, to scream, to drag the children from the house, but the Benson parents stood beside her, proud and serene, and the weight of their conviction pressed her down. Nora closed the cupboard gently, tying the twine back around the handles, though her chest burned at the thought of what it held. She told herself she would report it, that she would not stay silent. Yet as she climbed the stairs, she felt the quiet of the house swallow her resolve. Upstairs, the twins sat motionless in their cradle, ribbons around their wrists, their eyes half-lidded but aware. The nurse forced a smile, muttered something about their health, and stepped out into the black air of evening. Behind her, the cupboard of jars waited in the cold cellar, each one remembering a sound that no longer lived, each one proof that silence could be bottled and kept. Midsummer's day came heavy and airless, the kind of heat that pressed the skin and dulled thought. But in the Benson house, the air grew colder the deeper one stepped. The cellar had been cleared and prepared, its stone floor scrubbed until it gleamed damp in the lamplight. The wide tin basin sat in the center, filled not with plain well water, but with brine warmed over coals, steam rising in faint curls that carried the sting of salt. Around it, lamps were turned low, their wicks trimmed, so shadows leaned long across the walls. From above came the faint hum of a hymn, voices muffled through the boards, though no neighbors recalled singing that day. Rose and Lila stood barefoot at the edge of the basin, thin linen shifts clinging to their skin, their small hands folded at their sides. They had been told that this was their second birth, that the first cry of life was nothing compared to the silence they would carry now. Samuel and Martha stood close, the ledger open on a small table, the pages filling with symbols and dates. Verity Hale directed each movement, her clean hands smoothing the twins' hair back from their foreheads, her voice soft as if coaxing them into sleep. Pastor Ephraim Ward stood with her, book in hand, murmuring words that sounded less like blessing than command. Caleb Rowe lingered at the stairs, pale and trembling, the brass watch clutched in his fist, though no one had asked him to keep time today. The ritual seemed beyond minutes, stretching instead into something weightier, eternal. Martha dipped cloth into the steaming brine and pressed it against each child's chest, whispering that the water would write discipline into their lungs. The twins shuddered but made no sound, their obedience praised as proof that the lessons had taken root. From the shadows beyond the door, a single eye watched. Harlan Finch, a young journalist from the county paper, had followed a rumor here. Something whispered in a tavern about jars of silence in a house where children never cried. He pressed himself against the crack, notebook hidden in his coat, breath caught in his throat as the scene unfolded. He saw the steam, the basin, the children standing motionless while adults smiled as if salvation were being delivered. He heard fragments of the hymn rise through the boards and fall again, the sound thin and hollow as though the house itself were singing. His stomach turned, but he did not move, fearful that any sound from him would be swallowed into the ritual itself. One by one, the twins were lifted and lowered into the basin, the warm brine lapping their chests, their arms stiff against their sides. Pastor Ward intoned that the water would seal their silence. Verity murmured that they were being perfected, and Samuel marked the page with neat circles, each stroke of ink a record of what could not be undone. Rose's eyes closed, her lips parting only to release a shallow breath, while Lila stared ahead unblinking as though she understood that resistance had no place here. When the cloths were removed and the twins stood dripping salt streaking down their necks, the room held its breath. No cry rose, no protest broke the air. Only the ticking of Caleb's watch filled the silence until he realized his hand was shaking too violently to keep it steady. Harlan slipped back from the door, his heart hammering, the weight of what he had witnessed pressing into his ribs. He wanted to shout, to run, to drag the children into daylight, but his legs carried him away in silence. Behind him, the cellar glowed with lamplight and steam, the brine cooling as if the ritual itself had drained the room of heat. To those inside, the twins had been born again, perfected through obedience, baptized not into faith but into silence. And when the hymn faded and the ledger closed, the Benson house seemed colder than ever, as though its walls had agreed to keep the secret. The storm that swept through in late autumn cracked trees and loosened stones, leaving the Benson porch sagging at one corner. When the rain cleared, Deputy Jonah Cutter arrived to inspect the damage. He was not called. He came on instinct, uneasy after months of whispers about the twins who never cried, the house that never seemed to breathe. He walked the perimeter slowly, boots sinking into the soft earth, eyes drawn to the gap where the porch foundation had shifted. Kneeling, he pried loose a stone and found something small wedged in the damp soil. It was a mask, carved from thin wood, no bigger than a child's face. The eye holes were uneven, the mouth a narrow slit. It looked less like play and more like instruction, a tool meant to press silence over lips too young to resist. Jonah turned it over in his hand, his chest tightening as the grain of the wood showed teeth marks at its edges. He pushed deeper into the shadows under the porch, his fingers brushing against another object. A narrow board, smoothed by use and carved with shallow notches across its surface. At first he thought them scratches, but when he held the board to the light, he saw they were tally marks, rows of short strokes grouped in tens. Between them were faint symbols, small circles, lines, the same shapes he had seen once in ledgers kept by doctors for recording pulse or breath. The truth cut him cold. This was no game. It was a record of lungs trained, of silence measured, of childhood reduced to count and mark. Inside the house, Jonah moved carefully, announcing his presence but hearing no reply. The air felt heavy as if it resisted his steps. He opened the door to the small back room, the one neighbors whispered about but never entered, and the silence inside pressed against him like weight. The walls swallowed every sound, his breath vanishing before reaching his ears. In the center lay the cradle, still and waiting, and beside it a small table where the good breath ledger sat open. He stepped closer and saw the pages covered in neat ink, rows of dates and symbols, but the last entry had stopped mid-line. The page he looked upon was blank, as though the writing had ended suddenly, as though the record itself had reached its limit. Jonah felt the silence pull at him, dragging thought into stillness. He touched the ledger with his hand and felt the paper cold as stone. A draft stirred, but no sound followed. He backed out of the room quickly, heart hammering, certain the walls did not only absorb noise, but craved it. Outside, the storm-scattered yard lay empty, yet he felt eyes on him, the echo of rituals done in darkness lingering like smoke. He pocketed the mask and the carved board, unsure whether they were evidence or relics, then glanced once more at the sagging porch where the stone had slipped. Beneath it, he imagined, more objects waited, hidden and patient. When he left the Benson house, the door closed without sound, as though the building itself approved of his departure. The ledger remained behind on its blank page, the room with no echo still waiting, its silence deep enough to erase even memory. To Jonah, the property no longer felt like a home. It felt like a machine, a place built to train obedience into flesh, its lessons carved into wood, cloth, and bone. The hearing was held in the town's narrow courthouse, a low brick building where dust clung to the high windows and every sound carried too far. Judge Ada Whitcomb presided, her gray hair pinned back so tight it made her face look carved, her eyes steady but weary with the knowledge that truth did not always find its way into law. It was not a trial, though people whispered the word outside on the steps. A trial meant charges, meant guilt could be weighed. This was something smaller, safer, a hearing to consider whether the rumors of the Benson household required intervention. The benches filled with neighbors who shifted uneasily, their faces pale under the thin morning light. None wished to speak too loudly, for scandal in a town this size was poison that never washed out. Clara Dunn was the first to step forward. Her voice wavered as she described the winter afternoons when she had seen Rose and Lila laid on the porch under thin quilts, lashes frozen white, lips too blue for children meant to thrive. She said she had left broth, that she had questioned Martha, but the calm smile she received had silenced her. Judge Whitcomb nodded, but her quill hesitated over the paper. Without proof beyond sight, the words hung in the air like smoke, visible but vanishing too quickly. Next came Caleb Rowe, his face drawn thin, his hands trembling as he clutched his hat. He spoke of the barn lessons, the splints stiffened with salt, the breath counts through paper tubes, the brass watch he had been forced to keep steady while the girls struggled for air. His stomach had turned, he said, but fear had bound his tongue. The room stirred at his words, but the judge's pen moved only slowly, for his account lacked the weight of record. He had no ledger to offer, only memory. Nora Bell, the county nurse, rose last. Her voice carried more steadiness, but her hands trembled as she described the cupboard of jars in the cellar, each one holding cotton pressed flat, each one marked with dates as if cries had been collected and filed away. She said it was wrong, unnatural, but when pressed for detail, she faltered, knowing the jars had seemed so ordinary to the eye. She admitted she had closed the cupboard herself, that she had tied the twine back around the handles, and the court shifted uncomfortably. Without evidence in hand, her testimony too seemed fragile, like something that could be dismissed as imagination. Then came Verity Hale. She entered in a pressed dress the color of pale sky, her hair neat, her hands folded clean. She spoke with a soft smile, calling everything the witnesses described teaching. The cradle, the porch, the jars. Each, she said, was a method of discipline, a way to raise children strong, a way to spare them weakness and grief. She said she had never seen harm, only order, and that those who misunderstood it were ruled by fear. Her voice never trembled. She did not argue, she explained, and her explanations wrapped the room in a calm that was hard to resist. Neighbors on the benches nodded, murmuring that children needed shaping, that discipline had always been a mark of love. At the end, Judge Whitcomb ordered the good breath ledger brought forward. Samuel placed it on the table with reverence, the calfskin cover smooth under his hands. The judge opened it, scanning the neat lines of dates and symbols, the ordered record of silence disguised as care. She paused at the final blank page but said nothing of it. After a long silence, she closed the book and declared it private, the property of the family, not the court. The words settled like a stone dropped into deep water, sinking without ripple. The hearing ended without charges, without ruling. Witnesses left in silence, their testimony recorded but already fading in importance. Outside, the air felt heavier, as though the town itself exhaled relief that no scandal would darken its name. The Benson house remained untouched. The ledger returned to its table. The jars sealed in their cupboard. For all the words spoken in that courthouse, the truth never learned how to speak. Years slipped past, and though the Benson case never reached judgment, its shadow lingered in whispers carried from porch to mill, from tavern to church pew. Children grew wary of the Benson home, walking faster when they passed its gate, and parents lowered their voices when asked about Rose and Lila. The silence of that house spread wider than its walls, and though no court had spoken against it, the unease it birthed reached ears far beyond the town. In the state capitol, among papers and committees, Senator Miriam Klein heard enough fragments to stitch together a pattern. She was not a woman prone to rumor, but she understood that silence itself could be evidence, that when too many mouths stayed shut, it often meant something dreadful was being kept. Klein began drafting measures, small at first, tucked into broader laws about health and education. Midwives, she proposed, should be licensed, their methods recorded, their work accountable. Births at home must be registered within days, not months, so that no child might vanish between ledger and law. She insisted that private, quiet rooms, chambers built to swallow sound, should be forbidden, citing them as unfit for the raising of children. Most heavily debated was her final clause, that any child's death in a household must be confirmed by 2 non-family witnesses, a safeguard against silence being mistaken for peace. Legislators argued, ministers protested, some scoffing that such rules were needless meddling. Yet the stories that drifted from towns like the Bensons carried weight, and weight slowly shaped law. When the bill passed, it bore no mention of the Benson name. The record kept its dignity, but everyone who had followed the whispers knew why the measures existed. It became known quietly as the law of quiet rooms, and though officials avoided the phrase, families repeated it with relief. They believed it would keep homes from becoming prisons of silence, though laws cannot strip walls of memory once they have learned to listen. By the Black River, a memorial appeared, 12 stones set in a row, smooth and nameless, their surfaces left plain. No inscription marked them, no dates or initials. They stood like teeth against the bank, placed there not by decree but by hands that never admitted ownership. Some said the number was for the lessons recorded in the ledger, others that it was for children lost whose names would never be spoken. People came quietly, leaving flowers or toys, and left just as quietly, as if afraid the stones might answer. The river moved past them, slow and dark, carrying the memory forward. The town pretended it had healed, but the stones told a different truth. That silence had left its trace, and that only law had learned to speak in its place. The cellar is empty now. The basin sits where it always sat, its wide mouth dry, the metal dulled to a flat gray that no longer reflects lamplight. Dust gathers in its rim as if even the air has forgotten its purpose. The shelves that once held rows of jars stand bare, their wood warped with damp, though faint circles remain where the glass once pressed down year after year. The walls smell of stone and mildew, nothing more, and yet people who step inside still claim the silence feels thicker here than anywhere else in the house, as though the room remembers what was demanded of it. Visitors linger with their hands pressed lightly against their own throats, surprised by how quickly they begin to measure their own breathing. On a table beneath protective glass lies the Good Breath ledger. Its calfskin cover has softened with age, the ink within still sharp and neat, rows of circles and dashes that look harmless if one does not know their meaning. At first glance, it appears to be a family journal, the careful record of births, lessons, and milestones. But those who read further feel the chill of its rhythm. Each page marks silence achieved, cries erased, obedience measured not in kindness but in the absence of sound. The final blank sheet waits as it did when Deputy Cutter first found it, an emptiness that feels less like an ending than an unfinished demand. School children are sometimes brought to see it as part of history lessons, though teachers rarely explain more than a line or two. They lower their voices unconsciously as they stand before the glass, as though the book still insists on quiet. The town has grown since then, new houses raised, the mill long collapsed into ruin. Yet the Benson story remains, half forgotten but never gone. Locals point to the row of plain stones by the river and tell outsiders it is only a memorial for children lost to an epidemic. Few admit what was truly whispered, that silence itself had been worshipped here, and that children were shaped until they no longer remembered how to cry. To some, it was madness hidden behind discipline. To others, it was a method, too careful, too patient, too clean to be dismissed as accident. The cruelest truth is that none of it appeared monstrous in its time. A cradle that ticked like a clock looked like devotion. A ledger of lessons looked like care. Jars in a cupboard looked like order. And clean hands folded in prayer looked like love. Evil here did not roar or rage. It did not come with wild eyes or sudden blows. It crept in as neat marks on paper, as soft instructions whispered to tired parents, as rituals framed as healing. It hid behind what everyone wanted to believe: discipline, health, holiness, and it grew step by step until no one heard the last small sound. When people looked back, they wondered how they had not seen it sooner. How neighbors could leave broth at the door without asking why the children never cried. They wondered why the hearing had ended without verdict, why the jars had not been carried into the light, why the ledger had been returned instead of burned. The camera of history lingers on the basin, on the book under glass, on the stones by the river. These are the remnants left when silence was allowed to reign. They do not answer the questions people still whisper, but they remind us that the shape of cruelty is often tidy, that it wears clean clothes and steady smiles. And then a final voice asks, how do we recognize evil when it hides in calm hands and neat books, when it teaches step by step until even the air learns not to echo? Could this happen again? Or has it already somewhere behind a door no one has yet opened?